In the last video, we saw Thomas Jefferson express his suspicion on the Negroes being naturally inferior to the whites. In this video, to our surprise, we're going to witness a couple people who lived during Jefferson's time refute his claims and give their alternative explanation. So pay attention because we're going to get some understanding today. So let's commence our study by going into the book here called White Over Black by Dr. Winthrop D. Jordan. So let's go on here to page 441 where Jordan says this. In the years before the Revolution, anti-slavery men had increasingly recognized the importance, even the necessity of asserting Negro mental equality. But Jefferson's suspicions as advanced in the notes on Virginia greatly heightened the urgency of the question and stimulated much more widespread debate. So at least two things that we can extract from this. One is that although there were not many, there were at least some whites during this time who used their voice in defense of the enslaved. And this is important to acknowledge because it demonstrates that not all the whites at this time were foes, just like not all the blacks at this time were friends. It allows one to look beyond the outward appearances and look into the intentions and motivations of a person and make more accurate judgments primarily based on that. Right? So there were a few whites at this time who asserted that the Negroes were mentally equal, right? And two, Dr. Winthrop Jordan says Thomas Jefferson's suspicions, which were expressed in his writings called Notes on Virginia, this is what stimulated the debates on Negroes' intellectual inferiority. And that's because Jefferson wrote that he supposed the Negroes to be intellectually inferior to the whites, but he wanted to leave this into the hands of science to make a final conclusion. Right? And because Jefferson was respected and read by a lot of people during his time, these writings are what stimulated much more widespread debate on this topic. Now let's keep reading. Publication of the notes, 1785 in Paris, 1787 in London, and 1788 in Philadelphia, was followed almost immediately by public criticism of Jefferson's views, as well as by a marked increase in the frequency of speculation on the matter in general terms. Let's find out which members of the public criticized Jefferson for his remarks about the Negro. In 1792, Gilbert Imlay, a man of strange fortunes who had lived for a time in Kentucky, set out to refute Jefferson at some length, saying flatly that
it is certain
that Negroes and whites
are essentially the same in shape and intellect.
Now, Mr. Gilbert was a Northerner originally from New Jersey, which I assume must have played a great deal in the shaping of his views, because the North is where the anti-slavery movement began, and the seed thoughts of abolishing slavery were already germinating during his time, which is probably why he could fix his lips to say that the Negroes and the whites were essentially the same in shape and intellect. Now let's keep going. Jefferson's whole case for mental inferiority, Imlay declared, was absurd because it rested on comparison between slaves and free men. Equally specific attacks on Jefferson became more frequent after his involvement in national politics, and there were audible crescendos in the election years of 1796, 1800, and 1804. Often these volleys gave evidence of sincere disagreement with his views on the Negro, despite the fact that primary interest lay in defaming Jefferson the politician. Clement Moore, for example, a New York scholar of Hebrew with Federalist sympathies, controverted the notes on Virginia in considerable detail in 1804. Pay attention, he's about to knock Jefferson upside the head. Here we go. On the subject of Negro poetry, Moore wrote indignantly that
one would have thought that modern philosophy herself could not have the face to declare that the wretch who is driven out to labor at the dawn of day, and who toils until evening, with the whip flourishing over his head, ought to be a poet.
Right? How can one expect Negroes to excel in poetry, or any of the arts and sciences for that matter, when they're toiling in the field all day, and they have Daniel the driver, who was given 2 wives and a bunch of barbecue ribs by the master to watch over them and keep them in line by the whip if necessary, right? How can you expect that? One shouldn't expect people to produce high culture in that setting, right? A setting that restricts their ability to do so, which is fundamentally what he's saying, which ties back to what Gilbert Imlay said earlier about comparing the slaves to free people. Here we go. He went on to ask,
and does justice bid us examine their mental powers while in a state of servitude, rendered sullen by ignominy and broken down by labor?
In other words, is it right to examine people's mental abilities while they're enslaved and oppressed, and in such a way that destroys their mental and emotional state due to public humiliation and degradation, and also wears them down physically with much labor, right? That's the rhetorical question that he's posing to Jefferson. And here's what else Moore says.
And although in large and civilized communities there never appear more than a few scattered geniuses who deserve attention, does impartiality command us to criticize the talents and literary productions of a few Negroes who have escaped the unhappy lot of their brethren, and because they fall far short of European excellence, to degrade their whole race below the rest of mankind?
That's another valid point, that even in civilized nations, it's not like everyone's just popping up and becoming a recognized genius. Most people live a relatively average life, some below average, and only a few do anything that's noteworthy enough to be considered genius, right? So he's saying it's inappropriate to criticize the few free Negroes who aren't showing genius on a European level, and furthermore, not to assign the rest of their group to the bottom of humanity because of that, right? Now let's keep reading. The Reverend Samuel Stanhope Smith presented a brief and thoroughly inconclusive discussion of the possibility that environmental influences might have altered the Negro skull and hence his thought. Then he turned to the effects of slavery upon the intellect and effectively utilized Jefferson's own case against slavery, turning it on its head by presuming Negroes to be the principal victims. Now we have the good Christian Reverend Samuel Stanhope Smith, who was a Northerner as well, and it is said of him that he opposed the racial classifications created by Blumenbach and Carl Linnaeus. So let's hear what he had to say.
I am inclined, however, to ascribe the apparent dullness of the Negro principally to the wretched state of his existence. First, in his original country, where he is at once a poor and abject savage, and subjected to an atrocious despotism, and afterwards in those regions to which he is transported to finish his days in slavery and toil.
So for the Reverend, the Negroes' lack in demonstrated intellectual or imaginative abilities was not a matter of inherency or something natural, but rather it was due to external circumstances like living as what he called a poor and miserable savage in Africa in the beginning. And then later, it was due to the harsh slave conditions in America. And so basically for him, it was the environment that created the mental restrictions on the Negro. Now let's see what else he has to say.
Genius, in order to its cultivation and the advantageous display of its powers, requires freedom. It requires reward, the reward at least of praise, to call it forth, competition to awaken its ardor, and examples both to direct its operations and to prompt its emulation.
Now, the genius that he's referring to is the demonstration of genius that would be recognized on a larger scale, because when you peel back a few layers or when you dig deeper, we shall find that genius was in fact demonstrated by those who they called Negroes, even during slavery. But it's just a different degree of genius. Understand, the slave world was so small and so restricted that what it produced could hardly be compared to the what was produced in the world at large. But someone like Harriet Tubman, to me, I see as a genius. She used bravery to escape from slavery, which most people at that time were way too scared to do so. She was able to use strategic thinking to find routes to freedom. She used her social intelligence to know who to keep as an ally and who not to trust. And she was able to do this multiple times to help free a lot of people without ever getting caught, right? So to me, she was exceptional, right? And I consider her a genius within the slave world. But like I said, what the Reverend is referring to is genius recognized on a large scale. And to achieve that level, he wrote that the requirements were freedom, praise, competition, and examples. And let's see what else he says.
The abject servitude of the Negro in America, condemned to the drudgery of perpetual labor, cut off from every means of improvement, conscious of his degraded state in the midst of freemen who regard him with contempt, and in every word and look make him feel his inferiority.
That's the environmental pressure that the white society applied to the Negroes, to squeeze out every ounce of inferiority out of them, to where the Negroes consistently moved around in a state of inferiority, because the whites reinforced it through their every word and look, just like the Reverend just mentioned. And this is important to realize and take in, because this background is what provides the keys to understanding why certain people from this lineage navigate the society feeling a sense of inferiority today, right? It's an inherited consciousness, and it has its roots stemming from more than a century before this time period that we're addressing right now in this video. And the Reverend was clearly able to see what this looked like during the period of the late 1700s, where the whites were imposing this state of inferiority on the enslaved. Now let's see what else he said.
And hopeless of ever enjoying any great amelioration of his condition, must condemn him, while these circumstances remain, to perpetual sterility of genius.
Again, he's saying their condition and circumstance are what was preventing their genius. Smith went on to demolish the logic which Jefferson had employed in unfavorably comparing Negroes with Indians. Negroes, he pointed out, were cut
off from employments which, along with conscious freedom and independence, often awaken the untutored savage to the boldest enterprises.
Negroes were placed
in the midst of a civilized people with whom they cannot amalgamate, and who only humble them by the continual view of their own inferiority.
You see that? That was their intention, which was to keep them in that state. And you can imagine the mentality, culture, and character traits that people develop after being humbled like this for hundreds of years. They fall down into the pit. To place the Indian in that condition would be to
annihilate among them all the noble qualities which you had admired in their savage state.
Smith turned finally to Jefferson's argument from classical slavery.
But has this philosopher sufficiently adverted to the infinite difference that must subsist between enslaved savages, destitute of the first elements of liberal knowledge and held in contempt by their oppressors, and an ingenious and enlightened people, cultivated in the schools of philosophy, and practiced in all the liberal arts, reduced to slavery by force of arms, and even in slavery respected by their masters?
Here the Reverend is making a comparison between the ancient slaves like Greeks and Romans to the New World Negro slaves, whom he again is referring to as savages. And he's saying that there's a world of difference between these two. Let's understand. The Negroes were cut all the way off from knowledge, and they didn't even have a basic level of liberal arts at their disposal. And some of the ancient slaves were well trained in philosophy and liberal arts. And from that state, then they were reduced to slavery, and that's why they were respected by their masters. Or if they were born into slavery like Epictetus, they could, with permission of their master, become educated in Stoic philosophy and gain respect that way. And these were obviously two completely different circumstances and not properly fit for comparison, which is the point that he made. Heavy-handedly, Smith had groped his way toward the realization that not only slavery but the contempt of whites might affect the Negro's intellect. But he did not see or dared not say that explicit assertions of inferiority, like those by Jefferson, might breed inferiority in actuality. So there we have it, a little give back on Jefferson's statements on the Negro's natural inferiority. And so hopefully you have found this video and commentary valuable. I want to thank you right now for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.